Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. So my name is Jason James, and we're here on exactly the right day to talk about the Japanese national anthem and various things related to it, Kimigayo. And of course, it's the right day because today is the Emperor's birthday. So happy birthday, Emperor! Maybe we'll do a little singing later. I don't know. Anyway, we're very fortunate to have with us today Simon Cosgrove, who was a Daiwa scholar. So he went on our program to Japan some years ago, and he has stayed there. So Simon is now associate professor and head of liberal arts at Yoshibi University of Art and Design, where he teaches music history. But he also is very active as a performing jazz pianist. And he works closely with Matsuda Seiko as well. I think she's going to be making an appearance tonight. She's a very famous Japanese pop musician, if you are not aware who she is. And he's released 4 albums under his own name, and he also plays the shakuhachi, sort of Japanese flute. And on that note, I think I'll pass over to Simon. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Jason, for the warm welcome. Thank you to all of you for braving the cold and the rain to be here with us at Daiwa House this evening. It's a delight to see some faces I haven't seen in close to 2 decades, as well as many new faces as well. And special thanks to all the staff here at the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation for the kind invitation and for making this evening possible. By way of self-introduction, I think Jason has already said everything that I was going to say, but I came on the Daiwa Scholarship in 2003, and I remember clearly about 22 years ago quaking in my boots at the interview here at the Daiwa House. So it's nice for a change to be quaking in my boots at this podium instead this evening. So I'm still based in Japan now at Yoshibi University of Art and Design, and some of the students from Yoshibi are here with this evening. We're in the middle of a study trip to the UK. I'm also active as a jazz musician in Tokyo. You may not know, but Tokyo has one of the most vibrant jazz scenes in the world, with countless jazz clubs, dedicated jazz listening cafes, after-hours jam sessions, festivals, and some of the best record shops to be found anywhere on the planet. But this evening we are not going to be talking about Miles Davis. We're delving into the world of the Japanese national anthem, Kimigayo, that most mysterious and enigmatic of melodies. We're going to explore the origins, the history and the legacy of the anthem, and try to establish why it sounds so different from other national anthems around the world. Now, just a quick disclaimer before we get started. Kimigayo has been the source of some debate and controversy throughout its history, but today we'll be dealing solely with the music of the anthem, and there are no political affiliations or overtones to today's talk. So I probably heard Kimigayo for the first time on television, watching the Olympics or the World Cup when I was growing up here as a child in the UK. But I heard it more and more after moving to Tokyo in 2003. I remember how different it sounded to the rest of the world's national anthems. Now, the musician in me couldn't help but wonder why it was in this ominous minor mode rather than a major key, why some parts of it were sung in unison, others in 4-part harmony, and why it sounded, to borrow that technical term from music theory, really weird. Now, I thought nothing more of it until a few years ago when I moved to a town called Fussa on the western edge of Tokyo. Now, Fussa is probably best known as the location of the Yokota military air base. There's a large American military air base, home to some 13,000 military personnel. Now, every evening at 5 p.m., a bugle call sounds over the tannoy speakers, and the Japanese national anthem Kimigayo is played at full blast over the speakers, followed by a rendition of the American national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, one late spring evening in 2019, I was making dinner at home with the window open. I heard this motley medley of anthems drifting through the open window. And I couldn't help but think how different those two anthems sounded. This minorish, ethereal, asymmetrical Kimigayo in stark contrast with the rip-roaring melody of the Star-Spangled Banner, which, if you didn't know, was based on a drinking song. Now, my curiosity got the better of me, and I ended up writing an academic paper, which was published last year, called Kimigayo and the Meiji Musical Aesthetic. And tonight's talk will be a condensed version of that paper. So this is the Japanese national anthem, Kimigayo. Its composition is attributed to Hiromori Hayashi, who was an imperial court musician. And it was first performed at the Imperial Palace on November the 3rd, 1880, to mark the then Emperor's birthday, Emperor Meiji. Now, as some of you may be aware, today just happens to be the birthday of Emperor Naruhito, as Jason just informed us. It also happens to be my father's birthday today, but due to prior engagements, unfortunately, neither Emperor Naruhito of Japan nor Emperor Cosgrove of Pontefract were able to join us here this evening. So this composition has been used as the Japanese national anthem since that first performance in 1880, but it was only officially adopted in 1999. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this anthem to varying degrees, but let's refresh our memories first of all by listening together to Kimigayo, and feel free to sing along if you feel so inclined. Now, when I ask my students about this piece, some of them say it sounds dark and dreary, others think it's mysterious, obscure, others find it to be esoteric, stately, elegant, or even ethereal. Now, of course, our perception of music is subjective and more often than not is informed by our surroundings and our upbringing, other cultural factors as well. But I think we can all agree that this national anthem sounds very different to other national anthems that we may be accustomed to, and especially nothing like the national anthems that were in existence when Kimigayo was composed in 1880. But that's because it was composed on the other side of the world from the Star-Spangled Banner, God Save the King, by a musician who was steeped in the ancient traditions of Japanese court music, gagaku, with a totally different musical aesthetic. And you might be right, if it were it not for the fact that there was another version of Kimigayo written a whole decade before this one. Now, usually I have a piano when I'm lecturing or giving talks. This time I couldn't fit it in the overhead locker, so I've pre-recorded everything. Here is the original Kimigayo, and I found a particularly charming anime Vocaloid version of this. So let's listen together to the very first Kimigayo. Now, if I may have a show of hands, who's heard this version of Kimigayo before? Just one. Now, there's nothing dark and dreary here, nothing mysterious and obscure, nothing remotely esoteric or ethereal. In fact, as far as model national anthems go, it's a solid B minus. So what's the story behind this decidedly average anthem, Japan's very first Kimigayo? Well, this was actually composed by John William Fenton, a British military bandmaster who was based in Yokohama. But what was a British military bandmaster doing in Yokohama in the second half of the 19th century? And what on earth was he doing composing Japan's first national anthem? Well, I'm sure you all know that life in Japan changed drastically in 1868 with the so-called Meiji Restoration. After 250 years of relative isolation in the period of Sakoku, meaning closed country, Japan opened its floodgates to the rest of the world, and Western ideas and methods were adopted wholesale, leading to drastic reforms in government, education, social structure, economy, and the military. Leaders adopted slogans such as Wakon Yosai, meaning Japanese spirit, Western learning. Toyo no dotoku, Seiyo no gakuge, Eastern ethics, Western science, in a bid to establish Japan as a strong player on the global stage without compromising its core identities and values. It's no exaggeration to say that everything changed in Japan after the Meiji Restoration, and music was no exception. Now, the newly formed military wasted no time in employing John William Fenton as Japan's first military bandmaster in 1869. And he was put in charge of around 30 young soldiers who had no experience in Western music. And they were playing on these crude instruments, which a journalist for the Yokohama-based English newspaper, The Far East, reported were made in Japan by mere tuners and copper workers. In fact, Western music was largely unknown in Japan before the years leading up to the Meiji Restoration. There were exceptions, small pockets of Portuguese Catholics singing hymns and whatnot in the 16th century. But even after Western music was introduced to Japan, a German doctor living in Japan at the time, Leopold Müller, noted, "The Japanese find our music even more abhorrent than we find theirs. A cultured Japanese cannot stand it." So it's fair to say that music was not appreciated for its aesthetic value. So let's return to John William Fenton. It's not the most flattering portrait we have of Mr. Fenton, and his new position as Japan's first military bandmaster in 1869. Now, shortly after coming to Japan, John Fenton noticed that Japan didn't have a national anthem. And the new leaders of post-Meiji Japan were soon made aware that a national anthem was a necessity in order to be taken seriously on the international stage. Fenton introduced his fledgling band members to God Save the King. And this model inspired a high-ranking artillery captain by the name of Iwao Oyama, who was well-versed in Japanese and Chinese literature, to select a 10th century verse entitled Kimigayo, meaning the reign of our Lord. Now we can see here the text of Kimigayo, the original 10th century verse, and also the words to God Save the King. Now, it's a bit of a push to suggest any deep aesthetic connection between the two verses, but they do both celebrate the ruler and appeal for a long reign. Kimi there representing the ruler. Of course, we have the king, the reign continuing until the tiny pebbles grow into massive boulders and so forth. Now, in early August 1870, John Fenton was handed a copy of the Kimigayo poem in Romanized text. I like to imagine it looked something like this. Now, Fenton didn't really speak Japanese. He didn't understand the intricacies of the language. He had this Romanized text to work with, but he asked for more time to really understand the Japanese language before taking on this task of writing Japan's first national anthem. However, it was announced that the anthem must be performed in Echujima at a military review on September the 8th, 1870. So the project was hastened, and Fenton reluctantly penned the simple melody, that first version of Kimigayo. Now, his anthem was used as the de facto anthem for around 6 years, after which a committee was formed to revise the anthem. Now, before we see how and why that anthem was rewritten, let's take a look at what was happening in music education and music in the years immediately after the Meiji Restoration. Now, I'm sure as many of you are aware, Japan had a long, rich and varied music history before the arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships and the adoption of Western music in the second half of the 19th century. Gagaku, which is said to be the world's oldest orchestral music, dates back to the Heian period at the tail end of the 8th century. And other styles of traditional music, heikebiwa, shakuhachi, the music of no theatre, and the colourful tapestry of folk songs from the provinces thrived in Japan from the imperial court to the independent chamber. But all of this was to change abruptly with the arrival of Western music. Many of these traditional genres were uprooted, almost made extinct by the introduction of Western music, with the exception of Gagaku, the imperial court music, which remained largely unchanged and unaffected. Enter Shuji Isawa. Now, Shuji Isawa was an important figure in establishing the guidelines for music and musical education in post-Meiji Japan. Shuji Isawa was based at the Ministry of Education, and he was responsible for making music compulsory in schools from 1872. His focus was not a whole-scale adoption of Western music and getting rid of Japanese music entirely, but balancing those two elements. And Isawa, in tandem with Luther Whiting Mason, who was an American musical pedagogist, published a series of songbooks called the Shogaku Shokashu, which became the foundation for the new musical style. Now let's dig a little deeper and take a look at the musical nuts and bolts of these songs. The songs that Shuji Isawa was promoting in post-Meiji. Many of them used what looks like a very difficult scale, but is actually very simple, the anhemitonic pentatonic scale, which in Japanese is called the yonanuki scale. The yonanuki scale. Now, the foundation of Western classical music is the 7-note scale, the major and minor system. What the yonanuki, the Japanese moniker, represents is that the yo, the 4th degree of the scale, and the na, the 7th degree of the scale, are removed, which leaves us with 5 notes. Let's watch a little animation to see how this scale works. First of all, we start with the regular major scale. Then take out the 4th and 7th degrees. Now, this scale can be found in vernacular pentatonic modes in traditional Japanese music, but we also find it in Western folk melodies, such as the Scottish song Auld Lang Syne, which for the Japanese among you will know that is used every day when shops close. Here in the UK, of course, it's sung at New Year's. So we can consider this scale as a kind of a hybrid mode, which fits Isawa's ideal of balancing elements of Western and Japanese music. Now, I analyzed 60 songs from the Shogaku Shokashu and found that the melodies of 18 of them were based exclusively on this scale, and that other songs made partial use of the scale. Now, in contrast, here's another slightly difficult technical musical term, the hexatonic ritsu mode. This is made up of 6 notes. This scale we will find later in today's talk, appears in Kimigayo, but it wasn't used in many of the songs that Shuji Isawa used. In fact, only 6 songs out of the 60 that I looked at featured the hexatonic Ritsu mode. Let's move on now. So let's listen to a very well-known piece of music by Shuji Isawa. This is Kigensetsu, which was actually written a couple of decades after Fenton's version of Kimigayo. But we can see here that the melody is made up entirely of the Yonanuki scale. If we analyze the melody there, we can see it's made up of only those notes. It also has a very simple hymn-like structure made up of 4-bar phrases. Now, of course, 4-bar phrases had been a thing in Western music from Renaissance madrigals through Bach chorales, and even the Happy Birthday song, which incidentally was also written in 1893. But 4-bar units were emphatically not a common feature of traditional Japanese music and poetry. If we think of that most representative of Japanese poetic forms, the haiku, 5-7-5. As the old saying goes, to write a poem with 7 syllables is very difficult. So back to the unit of 4. We see the 4-bar phrases, also a 4-part harmony in the piano accompaniment there as well. But we can also see, we're going to listen to this piece of music in a second. The first 4 bars are sung in unison. We then have 4 bars in 4-part harmony, and so on and so on. So we can see a very easy to understand representation of Isawa's aim to blend Western and Japanese elements. Let's listen together to Kigensetsu. So we have the piano accompaniment in 4-bar harmony, 4-part harmony as the introduction, and then a unison phrase. Piano accompaniment with 4-part harmony. And then again, a unison phrase, and so on and so on. So we have this blend here, 4 bars at a time, unison, and then Western 4-part harmony. Now, before we look at the 2 versions of Kimigayo and how they relate to the musical reforms of post-Meiji Japan and the aesthetic of Meiji Japan, let's look together at the characteristics of national anthems. What defines a national anthem? What do they usually sound like? And why do composers write them the way they do? Well, when Fenton composed the first Kimigayo in 1870, only 39 countries in the world had a national anthem, most of them in Europe and the Americas. National anthems, of course, were first adopted by European monarchies in the late 18th century as patriotic compositions in praise of the ruler. Now, as part of my research, I analyzed almost 200 national anthems. I found that 92.4% of them, or 183 of them, were in a major key. Of course, that tonality that's often considered to be happy, bright, positive. I also found that 91.4%, or 181 out of the 198 that I analyzed, had a final dominant tonic cadence. That's that magnetic ending point that we often hear in classical music. On the other hand, only 7, or 3.5% of them, were written in a minor key, that tonality that's often conceived to be sad. And the rest Some of them had indigenous elements. We'll move on to some of those later in the talk today. Some of them had regional traits. For example, the anthems of Latin America tend to be very long, those epic anthems. And most of them were written in a slow tempo, with the exceptions of Bangladesh and India, which are marked allegretto e espressivo and allegretto moderato, respectively. So bearing those kind of keystones of national anthems in mind, let's now see how Fenton's Kimigayo and Hayashi's Kimigayo fare as national anthems. So let's start with Fenton's version. We can see here a 16-bar composition made up of 4 4-bar phrases. Clearly defined phrases. We also have a strong dominant tonic cadence at the end. We'll hear that here. A sense of finality, the piece is finished. It's a slow tempo, a very simple rhythm, made up mainly of minims with a couple of crotchets there and 2 fermatas at the end of the phrases. It's also written in with the yonanuki scale. Apart from this F natural that appears here, every other note in the melody is made up of that scale we looked at a few moments ago, the anhemitonic pentatonic scale, the yonanuki scale, which can be applied to both Western and Japanese music. Now the anthem is harmonized using Western 4-part harmony, which is stylistically reminiscent of the stately European anthems, and there are no unison sections to speak of. It's harmonized from the beginning to the end. But there are some problems with Fenton's version. It ticks a lot of boxes when it comes to matching the characteristics of national anthem. But there's a fundamental flaw here, which is the misalignment of music and text. Those of you who speak and read Japanese may have noticed when we listen to Fenton's version, there are a few awkward moments there with melody and text. In fact, the anthem was slated as completely unsingable if you were Japanese. And the asymmetric 31-syllable waka poem, which is made up of 5-7-5-7-7, that Fenton was handed, offered no clues to the syntax and the rhythm of Kimigayo. So he basically forced this ancient Japanese waka poem into a 16-bar European paradigm. I've also put some danger spots there where the phrasing, the rhythm, perhaps these bimoraic, bisyllabic words are forced into a single note. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Japanese, or indeed unfamiliar with 10th century Japanese poetry, perhaps a parallel example from the world of Japanese pop music will help us to understand. Now here is Seiko Matsuda Seiko, who is perhaps one of the most famous Japanese so-called idols of the last 50 years. Matsuda Seiko made her debut in the early 80s, and I've had the privilege to play with her over the last 6 or 7 years. Now, in December of last year, I was involved with Seiko Matsuda's annual dinner show, at which we performed one of her hits, Sweet Memories, from 1982. And every time I hear that song, one of the verses is in English, and it always grates a little bit. The English itself is fine. It's grammatically sound. There are no real problems with the text, but it doesn't fall in line with the natural rhythm of the text and melody. Let's watch, and hopefully you can see what I mean.
Since the lady has
have spent so many nights thinking of you. It just doesn't really fit the melody quite right. And I have a feeling that that was the integral problem with Fenton's version of Kimigayo. The text and the music were not aligned properly. Let's take a look now at Hayashi's version of Kimigayo. Now, the problems with Fenton's versions were a point of contention throughout the 1870s, and in January 1880, the Department of the Navy officially requested the imperial household to provide a new version of Kimigayo, and the new melody was selected by committee. Now, it's attributed to Hiromori Hayashi, but there's some speculation as to who indeed wrote the music. Now, this version of Kimigayo, interestingly, is conceived not as a brand new composition, but as a revision of Fenton's version. When we heard both anthems side by side at the beginning, they sounded rather different. But if we take a close look at certain phrases, especially the yachi yoni sazare, you can see the melodic contour. Very similar. That was, of course, Fenton's version, and then Hayashi's version. So there's a clear melodic similarity there, but the way it's harmonized, the overall structure is so different that we don't necessarily perceive that as a revision. It sounds like a totally new version of the anthem. Now, this is an 11-bar composition. We don't have any of those ubiquitous 4-bar phrases. It's also written in the Ritsu mode. I mentioned that a few moments ago as one of the traditional Japanese scales or modes that was used in just a handful of Shuji Isawa's songs. But definitely to Western ears sounds more ambiguous. It's harder to fit with the pre-existing tonal system. Now, we can also see there some unison passages. If we look at the first and the last phrase, there's no harmony applied here. Kimigayo wa and also sumade. These are entirely unharmonized. Now, the anthem itself was harmonized by Franz Eckert, who was a German military bandmaster who took over from Fenton. And this is just my opinion, but my feeling is that the reason these two phrases are in unison is not to reflect the unity of the Japanese nation, the national polity. That's a commonly held belief or commonly held opinion. My take on it is that Franz Eckert couldn't get his head round these phrases in the context of Western harmony. Especially the first phrase, we have D, C, D, E, G, E, D. This goes against all the rules of leading tone and tonic. If that was a D sharp, it would be a totally different story. It'd be very simple to harmonize as a tonic, dominant, perhaps a subdominant, dominant, tonic. But the C natural there throws everything out of whack. And again, the final phrase as well. There's also no real tonic throughout the whole piece. Eckert tried his best in the middle here to add harmony, and it follows the rules to an extent, but it's definitely not the kind of thing that you would see in a Bach chorale, for instance. Now, if only Eckert could have traveled forward in time and applied perhaps 20th century classical harmony or even jazz harmony, it might have sounded something like this. But alas, his harmonic palette was limited to classical European traditions. But one of the reasons for the success of this anthem, in contrast with Fenton's composition, is that the melody matches the text of Kimigayo flawlessly. The Japanese naval musicians had also acquired a whole decade of experience since the days of Fenton, and they were better equipped to perform the new arrangement. In addition, this Ritsu mode that we talked about, it might sound ambiguous to Western ears, but it has its connection to gagaku, that most ancient of Japanese music, presents itself as a national symbol linking the anthem to ancient musical traditions. Now, Hayashi's version was the only national anthem of its time without a perfect cadence. It really was a unique anthem at its time, and the only anthem as well with indigenous elements. But as we move forward into the 20th century, we can see more countries using indigenous modes, such as if you listen to the national anthem of Bhutan, Cambodia, Mauritania, Sudan, and Vietnam. In fact, the national anthem of Kenya, the first phrase, there's a clear similarity there with the use of a unison melody and also indigenous modes there. So let's listen to these two phrases side by side. And then the Kenyan national anthem. So from this perspective, we can even perhaps conclude that Hayashi's approach was ahead of its time, innovative, revolutionary, and it marked the beginning of a style of national anthem which celebrated indigenous elements on the global stage. But let's now return to the title of this evening's talk. Which version of Kimigayo captures the musical aesthetic of Meiji Japan? Which anthem is more suited to the role of national anthem to represent Japan on the global stage? Now, of course, these are subjective questions, but I have here two quotations. First of all, Paul Nettle, in his book National Anthems, writes, "One people will not adopt the melodies of another without letting them undergo certain alterations commensurate with its own character." First of all, Fenton's melody, it's based on the Yonanuki scale. That's commensurate with the musical ideals of early Meiji Japan, while Hayashi's anthem, steeped in centuries of gagaku tradition, captures that own character of Japan. Then some words from Karen Cerullo, musical symbols by which nations declare themselves internally as cohesive and externally as distinctive. I think we can all agree that from this second definition, Hayashi's Kimigayo, the version that we still use, pips Fenton's anthem to the post with its internally cohesive unison passages, that indigenous Ritsu mode, and together with a tonality that sounds distinctive, even ambiguous, against the backdrop of Western harmony. So in closing, the story of Kimigayo is the story of music in Meiji-era Japan. The original version by Fenton was a wholesale import, written by an imported composer in an imported Western style, based on an imported aesthetic. It met all of the qualifications of the national anthem style, and it served a practical and pragmatic purpose. But it needed to be adapted to suit the terroir of its new surroundings. Hayashi's version, on the other hand, borrowed from the ancient musical tradition of gagaku and established the anthem as a national symbol of Japan, in turn paving the way for the use of indigenous musical elements in national anthems. So just as post-Meiji Japan readily absorbed Western ideas and methods, but adapted them to forge and maintain a unique identity, so too Kimigayo underwent a process of discovery that resulted in a national anthem to represent the Meiji musical aesthetic. Thank you very much for listening.